Hello, everyone. I'm State Senator Brian Kavanagh. I apologize for the false start of this, but it is 7:01 p.m. and welcome to our first virtual town hall meeting of constituents in Senate District 26, which is Lower Manhattan and parts of Western Brooklyn. We're very pleased to be with all of you tonight and to have some terrific experts who are going to talk about some issues that have come to our attention from constituents during the course of our month-long experience now with this COVID crisis, really about a month and a half now, and also the many, many questions that have been submitted in response to our invitation to this town hall. Just a few programming notes. First of all, this is being simultaneously translated in Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. And there's a translation feature on Zoom that I assume those who need that will be able to access. And each of the tapes of that will be available afterwards, posted on Facebook and our own Senate website. Just some very brief introductory remarks. We really are going to try to focus on the Q&A and the experience of our experts tonight. But just to say, this has been a really extraordinary time for all of us here in New York. We know that people are facing enormous challenges in terms of dealing with mourning for loved ones and the continued threats to people's health. We still have, although we've gotten over the peak, we have a lot of people who are still in very serious condition in our hospitals, and of course our healthcare system and really all of our systems for providing services and food and housing, and our businesses, as we're going to talk about tonight, really have been under tremendous strain. My staff and I have been working very hard to meet the needs directly of our constituents. We've been working to make sure the food distribution is in good shape, including some of my staff and I have been out at some of the distribution sites to make sure that that's running smoothly and to help out where we can. We have been pushing very hard to get the unemployment system up and running, which is the first, for many, many people, sort of the first set of benefits that we hope people will be able to access to sort of diminish the burden of this time. And of course, we know that that system was initially really quite overwhelmed as we were trying to get benefits out to so many people. We've pushed for changes, and we're still working with the state government to ensure that that system gets better as we go and that benefits get out to people. And of course, we've been working on legislative and policy solutions. We've been pushing for our federal delegation to take certain steps and working with them to identify needs and figure out ways the federal government can identify them, particularly through funding, and we're going to talk about that tonight, and also to develop solutions at the state level through legislation and also through the many activities of state government agencies that are acting administratively to try to address the situation. Tonight, we are going to have two panels. The first is regarding housing and homelessness, and that will run from about 1 minute from now till about 8 o'clock, and then we will transition and talk about small business issues, and we have a great panel for that. But let me, without further ado, begin by introducing our panelists on housing and homelessness. And I'm actually just going to tell people who you are and then ask you to briefly introduce yourselves. But Ellen Davidson and Josh Goldfein are both attorneys of the Legal Aid Society. And if each of you just want to say briefly kind of what you do and what your expertise is.
Hi, I'm Ellen Davidson, and I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, and I work on housing issues.
Great.
And I'm Josh Goldfein. I'm also a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, and my practice is mostly around homelessness issues and helping people move out of shelter and into permanent housing.
Great. And just to preview again, for those of you who are on here for small business, that will be at 8 p.m. And we're very happy to have Greg Bishop, the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services, and Andrew Flam, who's the Regional Director of the Pace University Small Business Development Center. And again, that will begin at 8 o'clock. We've received a total of 250 questions for this 120-minute segment. So you can do the math on how challenging it'll be to respond to all of those, but we are going to give it our best shot here. And my staff has kind of collated the questions and combined some of them. And so we're going to try to hit as many of the issues that people have raised. We've also, as we noted in the reminder today, people can add questions to the chat, and we will try to get to some of those as well. But again, we're going to try to prioritize the ones that came in advance. So just very briefly, the housing issue obviously has become a central concern for New Yorkers, not just in our neighborhoods, but across the state. We took some initial steps to protect both renters and homeowners during this crisis. I joined many of my colleagues in calling for a moratorium on evictions, and I know that the Legal Aid Society, which is represented here, was also very much involved in pushing for that. And that was granted first by the courts and then by a follow-up executive order that expanded it by the governor. So there was a 3-month moratorium on evictions, which began in mid-March and will go through mid-June. In addition, there is a forbearance on mortgages that is partly a federal directive that comes that addresses bank debt that is held by federal banks, and then we also have a state-level mortgage that deals with mortgage forbearance period that deals with state institutions. And again, that process is about forbearance. It's about delaying. It means that they can't take certain actions to collect or foreclose during the forbearance period. Obviously, with both of these things, they are temporary solutions, and a lot of people who have rent due or mortgage payments due are concerned about what happens at the end of that period, and we're certainly going to talk about that tonight. So without further ado, unless you guys have any other preliminary comments, I think I'll go to the first of our questions tonight. Okay, so I have Eddie from Manhattan who gets right to the point. What will we do tomorrow when rent is due? So Ellen, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about the current status and any protections that are available?
Right. So I think this is a problem that tenants are facing across the state, across the nation. I think people are in a lot of different situations. There are those who will qualify for unemployment benefits eventually, but because the system has been so backed up, currently have received no income since March. Access to the unemployment insurance benefits and simply cannot pay, and unless something is done to help them, will not be able to pay. And so to the extent that you're sitting and you're thinking, I simply do not have enough money to pay May's rent, you should know you're not alone. And that at this point during this crisis, there is a moratorium on evictions. There's actually both a state one and a federal one. The state one was given by the governor, and it says that no new cases can be brought, and no evictions, and no cases can move through the system, and no evictions can happen. That doesn't resolve the problem. It sort of to the problem. But at the moment, even if you can't pay rent, you do not have to fear being thrown into the streets, which I know a lot of people are very scared about, because as we've seen in this crisis, the folks who are suffering the most, who are getting sickest, are those who are unhoused. For those of us who have homes, we've become very clear that that housing is healthcare, and so having this moment is important, but it doesn't solve the problem.
And we have Josh Goldfein here. We're going to delve into the questions of homelessness as well a little while. In addition, I would just note we're going to try to get to some of the sort of more specific, the longer term solutions that we're considering both in Albany and at the federal level. Ellen, somebody asked, what can a landlord do at this point? Can they file failure to pay notices? Can they file rent demands? Can they file court cases?
Yeah, so landlords can file rent demands, which is just a notice from the landlord to the tenant saying, you owe rent, and if you don't pay rent, I'm going to bring you to court. However, landlords can't file cases in housing court because housing courts are places where hundreds and hundreds of people congregate in very, very tight spaces. It's a place where the coronavirus would rip through and cause a lot of people to get very sick. So they had to close the courts. And at this point, housing court is not set up to do anything digitally or remotely. And so as long as this crisis continues, the courts need to stay closed. As I mentioned, there's also a federal moratorium. It really covers buildings that are subsidized through HUD or have low-income housing tax credits. And for those, while a landlord can give you a notice that you owe rent, the actual notice the landlord has to give comes after that moratorium is lifted. The landlord then has to give a 30-day notice. So there's a little bit more protection if you're covered by the federal moratorium.
And that moratorium is a total of
20 days. Right. It goes until July 25th. And then there needs to be a 30-day notice. And that covers people who are in public housing, project-based Section 8, 811s, 202s, if you have a Section 8 voucher, if you live in a low-income housing tax credit building, and in other buildings that are covered by federal mortgages. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition has a map and a database that you can look up your address to see if you are covered by this moratorium.
And the next question is related, and I'll take the first of it. It says, Gabrielle from Manhattan asks, how long will the no eviction order be in place? And I guess to some extent that depends on how quickly we kind of recover from the crisis we're in. I think in New York in mid-March, 90 days seemed like a good start when we didn't know how severe things were going to get and how much economic disruption there would be, how long that closure, which is a very new thing then. So we had requested 90 days at that point at the state level. As Ellen noted, the federal government went with 120 days just a week and a half later when they were making the decision. It is my expectation that the moratorium will need to be extended, and the mechanisms to do that would be obviously the courts continuing to do it, to stay in the status they are, which is largely not taking cases except in extreme emergencies, none of which have to do with getting anybody evicted. And we could have the governor through executive order extended, and of course we could do it legislatively as well. So we're looking at all those options, but the moratorium currently ends in mid-June, and I think it is reasonable to expect, barring a very rapid change in circumstances and very rapid return to normalcy, that we'll be looking to extend that moratorium. If either of you has anything to add, then jump in. But, okay, great. We have a lot of questions about, so this is going on to questions about what happens when the moratorium ends. So this is Kristen from Brooklyn, and she writes, my boyfriend has lost his job during this time, and we are down to one income to pay rent. This has added an immense amount of pressure during the pandemic, and we are concerned about not being able to afford to continue paying rent during this time. I will just say we've heard, this is my staff has been picking questions that are representative of what we've been hearing both, every day throughout this crisis, and obviously in response to this. And this is a very, as Ellen noted, you're not alone if you're in that circumstance. We are working to find broader and longer term solutions. So as the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, I've been working with my colleagues to come up with a program that would address this essentially by paying people's rent to the extent they have need. And the idea would be that it would be a program that would hopefully rely on significant amounts of federal money. And we'll talk about the federal ask in a minute. And we may have a special guest on who's going to talk a little bit about the federal angle of this also in a moment. But the idea would be to create a program that puts rental assistance in people's hands. If you have some income, as Gabrielle does in her household, we would expect that you might pay 30% of your ongoing income toward your rent to the extent that you have any income at all. And in addition to that, then we would expect the government would cover the remainder. And this would be similar to many federal programs that provide vouchers to people to subsidize their rent, with two exceptions. One is it would be an emergency program, so it would be relatively short term, intended to keep people whole and safe and in their homes for the duration of this crisis. And in addition, it would cover rents that are higher than typical government programs. At least that's our current proposal. So with an understanding that the goal is to keep people where they are, to prevent people from getting displaced from their homes. So, and it would also be available, at least as we're currently thinking about it, a very similar program, or the same program, for people who are either facing imminent loss of housing, or they're facing eviction at the end of this, or people who are without homes now, homeless folks, and people who are living in public places or in congregate settings. And as Alan noted, COVID-19 really is very much, it's a public health crisis that very much is how you're affected by it depends on your circumstances, whether you're in a place where you can maintain distance from others and keep, have proper, sanitation ability to stay, clean your hands like we've all been learning to do more frequently than we usually do. So the goal is to create a broad program. And the idea, as I noted, is the federal government, which has already demonstrated a very substantial willingness to spend money to manage the impacts of this. And currently we're up to about $2.7 trillion has been allocated. We really are thinking that it is realistic to expect a very substantial amount of money from the federal government to deal with this most basic need. And my colleagues and I, many of us requested, about 200 of us actually, a lot of organizations as well as elected officials, have put in a request for $100 billion nationally, about $10 billion of which we hope would go to New York for programs like this and to support other housing needs. Our congressional delegation, including Jerry Nadler and Nydia Velasquez and Carolyn Maloney and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also have joined in this call for $100 billion to be in the next federal stimulus package. So we are optimistic there, but obviously that's going to take a lot of advocacy and also a lot of work at the state level to define the program and to advocate that that's in place as quickly as possible. Ellen, do either of you have other thoughts on just the sort of general question of how we ought to be responding to this to make sure that we don't have a wave of evictions at the end of the moratorium?
Yeah. I mean, you've seen the hashtag #Can'tPayMay all over Twitter, and that's just the facts on the ground. People can't pay their rent. And so as someone who represents tenants, there's a fear that we're about to hit a tidal wave of evictions, which is going to be, which is going to cause the coronavirus crisis to get worse, because it's staying in your homes is what stops the virus. We at the Legal Aid Society, we strongly believe that what is needed is money to help tenants pay their rent arrears so that they are not at risk of eviction. We also, it seems pretty clear to us that that money needs to come from the federal government. And I think it's going to take every single one of us to make sure that our federal elected officials understand that keeping people in their homes has to be one of their top priorities, if not their top priority. And providing pathways to permanent housing for those who are currently unhoused. Because again, what we need to do is stop this, stop the health crisis so that we can all go back to work and get our economy going. And we can't do that if people have no way of sheltering in place and stopping the virus.
Josh, you want to add anything to the question of the unhoused? There, you're on mute now.
Yeah, I've managed it. We have a lot of people currently in the shelter system in New York City, people who are living on the streets, people who were made homeless by this crisis, who had a place to stay, but have lost it either because even despite the eviction moratorium, they were living, say, week to week with somebody who is no longer going to allow them to stay there. People who had situations where they had a place they could go during the day that they just can't go anymore because that place doesn't exist. In fact, we've even seen that people don't have access to bathrooms. One of the things we've been scrambling to do is to get showers and toilets open in Midtown so that people have a place that they can just take care of their basic bodily needs. And as long as people are living in those kinds of situations or crowded in city offices or living in shelters that are like dorm style arrangements with maybe dozens of other people, we're all at risk of the virus continuing to spread. So what we really need, if we're going to end this crisis, if we're going to be able to move on, if we're going to be able to get back to what you described as something like normal, we really need to move people into stable housing, stable places that they can stay. We have, because there's no people coming to New York right now for business or tourism or to go to the theater, we have 100,000 empty hotel rooms in New York. So there are places that people can go, and we need to make use of them, but ultimately we're going to need permanent housing for people. And until we secure that, we're still going to have a risk of virus continuing to spread. That won't make any sense to have a plan like that if at the same time people are losing the homes that they're already in. We have to make sure that people can stay wherever it is that they already are, and then also for those people who have no place to go, that they have a place that they can stay and be isolated and not risk exposing themselves or others. And Ellen made reference to a hashtag about Campaign May. There's also, you can find a movement, Homeless Can't Stay Home. And the idea is, there's no way for people to do the things we're all supposed to be doing right now if they don't have a place that they can go.
Yeah, that's very, very eloquent. And again, we're at the state level, we are trying to really design a program that would be able to meet all those needs. And there is going to be this very strong effort to see if we can get adequate funding to cover the full range of people who are in need of permanent housing. So we have a few questions. So we've covered a lot from the resident and tenant perspective. We have a few questions about landlords. I'm going to try to keep this interactive, I'm going to try to do this in real time from the unfortunately small print in the chat box on my screen. But this, I believe it's Kim Lee Marquis, or Marquise, who says, while I understand that some people can't pay rent right now, what exactly are the landlords supposed to do to be able to pay the mortgages, insurance, taxes, utilities, etc.? Those of us who are small business rental property owners can't cover the housing costs for thousands of people. We'll end up losing the properties. We need help too. Airlines and hotels are getting help. Why aren't housing providers just as important? And I'll just take the first brief stab at that. And this is, again, we got a number of questions, variations on that. And I will just say that from my perspective in this crisis, while there are often tensions between landlords and tenants, and last year we had a big battle in Albany about changing the rent laws in ways that were intended really to strengthen the hand of tenants and protect tenants' right and provide justice for tenants throughout the state. In many cases, we were undoing loopholes that had been lobbied for by landlords over many years. In this crisis, I think there really is a very substantial commonality of interest. I think many tenants really, want to meet their obligation to pay their rent. They don't really want to have no income and not be able to do anything about that. And similarly, most landlords, although there are many that take advantage of tenants and don't meet their obligations very well sometimes, there are a lot of landlords that want to meet their obligations to maintain their buildings and do the right thing by their tenants. And we understand that that takes money, and we also understand that the property taxes are a significant element of how our city provides its services, and property taxes are a significant portion of where people's rent goes once you pay it to the landlord. So the solution we're proposing really does cut across both of those interests. And again, tenants and landlords, I think, are going to have a common interest in joining the fight to make sure there's adequate money to address the rent and the expenses necessary to keep these buildings up to date. And I don't know if either of you wants to add anything to that. Okay. Next, I have Paul from Battery Park City says, will there be relief for more than just rent stabilized units? Would it cover all other kinds of rentals? And the short answer is the proposal where that we've put forth is yes, it would be renters regardless of whether it's rent stabilized or market rate at this point, within certain limits. At some point, if you're renting a $20,000 penthouse somewhere, we may not endeavor to cover all of that rent, but the goal again is to cover rents that are somewhat expensive compared to the normal costs of government programs, and certainly rent stabilized tenants would 100% be included. Yulia from Brooklyn would like to know whether relief programs apply to someone who held a part-time job and lost that income due to COVID-19. Alan, either of you want to talk about that problem generally?
So any rent subsidy program would clearly cover anybody who's lost income because of COVID-19. I would like to say that there are some additional protections for people who've lost their job in terms of the unemployment insurance system. I know that that there's a sense that if you're a gig worker or a part-time worker, that you can't get access to those benefits. But there were some additional protections put into state law and some additional protections put into federal law. And I'll put it in the chat as well, but the Legal Aid Society has a hotline for people who are having trouble getting unemployment insurance benefits. And it's, I'll put it in the chat line, but people should call if they're having trouble or they're getting pushback that they don't qualify. Because once you unlock the unemployment insurance benefit from the state, you can get access to the $600 a week additional benefit coming from the Federal CARES Act. And that would provide people with some relief. So, yeah.
And I will just add that, especially for unemployment, I think the single biggest source of calls we've gotten for specific help has been about the unemployment benefits. And I was going to give our contact information at the end, but you can call our office at 212-298-5565, and we can help constituents ensure that your application is getting through and you're getting whatever benefits you're entitled to there as well. I've got a number of questions, again, trying to respect the fact that people are taking the time to type stuff in. I've got someone asks, has a rent freeze or cancellation of rent been discussed yet? And Paul from Battery Park City also asked in advance, what's the status of legislation to cancel rent or alleviate the rent burden? And Sean from Manhattan asks, I would like to know whether you support a rent moratorium. I'm going to assume the you in that question was me, the senator, rather than our panelists, although they can certainly jump in. And the short answer is that with another federal stimulus package coming soon, I really have focused on this effort to define a program that will pay people's rent rather than just sort of trying to announce that rent is no longer due on these apartments. I'm doing that because I think it is a sure way to address this enormous crisis and to make sure that everybody has the resources to stay in their homes. The cancel rent movement has gotten obviously a lot of attention. It's had a tremendous beneficial effect in making people really aware of how sort of deep this crisis is and how many people are struggling. And that's been an important step. But again, some of my colleagues really are pushing for this notion that, we should just cancel the rent. And I think that, whatever the merits of that, if we could accomplish it, I think it'll be very challenging. There'll certainly be challenges in court. And I think it'll be a longer process than people realize to get a cancellation of rent to stick. And ultimately, it might be up to judges who are, appointed over the past years at the state or federal level to make the determination of how that would work. So again, I think I and some of my colleagues have really focused on this notion that We should define a program, we should build support for it, and then we should go to our federal government, which really is the place where there are resources, financial resources to address the situation, to get that program funded. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if any of you have any other questions or comments about that.
I don't. I mean, I did see in the chat group someone was asking for more data. I think that there's been a lot of data that has come out about how many people have lost their jobs, how many people were already rent burdened before the crisis. The Furman Center just came out with a report looking at it. Community Service Society put out a report that talked about how most low-income tenants could survive without income for about a month. So there's an immense amount of data that's being done. National Low-Income Housing Coalitions, who's trying to determine how much rental assistance is needed nationwide, has a report that came out that looked at rent burdens per state, and then tried to consider how many more people have become low income since the crisis began by looking at the data in the financial crisis. So for people who are looking to know what the numbers are, there are immense amounts of reports that are coming out every day. On the Rent Guidelines Board, I would say, the one thing I would say that I found interesting, because there was a hearing today, is that it's clear there was a slide that was put into the presentation today about what's happened since March, which shows that people's rent burdens have gone up. But it is clear that the Rent Guidelines Board is currently considering data from last year. And so that unless there is a suspension of the process, which I think has to come from the state, everything that's happened to us right now will not go into the consideration of what rent increases should happen this year, which seems crazy to rely on last year's data and not even take into consideration what's going on.
Yep. So, and I just want, I think it's worth clarifying. People sometimes use the term cancellation of rent and rent freeze and some other terms interchangeably, but for a lot of people, the cancel rent means, nobody pays rent. There is a separate issue which relates to whether the Rent Guidelines Board is going to grant an increase for about 1 million or so apartments that the Rent Guidelines Board in New York and in the surrounding counties govern. And as Ellen notes, their normal process is to look at the rent from how much expenses have changed in the past year relative to a prior year. And so they're going through the motions of that, but to the extent that process is governed by law, we could either just take a legislative step and say, we don't need that process this year, we know the answer, and the answer should be a freeze. We also could change the law to say that they ought to be considering the dire circumstance our city is in. I think in either case, you would likely get the same outcome. But we are going to, we're going to continue to focus on that question, and I know some of my colleagues have proposed legislation to address it. Do we have our, are we ready to introduce our special guest this evening? I'm looking at the chat. We have Congressmember Jerry Nadler on the line, who is, I believe, not a constituent of mine, but obviously a great leader in our community and represents many of my constituents. So welcome, Congressman Jerry Nadler, who, I'm going to keep the introduction brief, but has been, a tremendous force in Washington for, holding this executive administration accountable and just advocating in sometimes very difficult circumstances for the needs of New Yorkers. And has, a major leadership role in Congress. So welcome, Congressmember Nadler, and I'll give you an opportunity to address our assembled constituents.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, Senator, for holding this forum. I want to talk for a few minutes about what we have done in Congress for renters and homeowners, and what I'm fighting for the next bill. We've passed a number of pieces of legislation, and we anticipate that sometime in the next few weeks, certainly within the next month, we will have to pass another bill which is being referred to as COVID-4. We've passed in the last month 2 major pieces of legislation that included protections for homeowners and renters, including those in public housing and those receiving housing assistance. The CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, I always wonder who dreams up these acronyms, and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Both bills provided some protection and resources for renters and homeowners. The CARES Act included a 4-month moratorium on evictions for people living in public housing, subsidized and unsubsidized, and for renters whose landlord has a federally backed mortgage. Now, people don't realize it, but probably better than half of all mortgages are federally guaranteed. So even if you live in a regular apartment building, not a Mitchell-Lama or anything else, there's a good odds that the mortgage securing from your landlord is federally guaranteed, and therefore this 4-month moratorium on evictions applies. Landlords cannot issue a 30-day notice to vacate to a tenant until after the moratorium is lifted, and tenants cannot be charged late fees. For public housing residents, the eviction moratorium applies to those living in public housing, tenant and project-based Section 8, Section 202 supportive housing for the elderly, Section 811 supportive housing for people with disabilities, housing opportunities for people with HIV/AIDS, known as HOPWA, Section 236 program, and housing receiving assistance through the McKinney-Vento Home Investment Partnership with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credits. And again, all these together are a very substantial portion of all the rental housing. New York State has also placed a moratorium on evictions through June 20th. And if you believe your landlord is not complying with the federal or state moratorium, contact Legal Aid or the Met Council on Housing, or contact my office. We can help also. As I said, we'll be legislating probably in the next few weeks another bill. And I am pushing several things for that bill. One, along with a number of others, I have signed several letters to the leadership asking for at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance for tenants. I'm also co-sponsoring legislation to cancel all residential rent and mortgage payments until the emergency declaration is lifted. The bill would also create a fund to cover losses for landlords and lenders as long as they comply with fair renting and lending practices for 5 years. Now, as I said, these 2 provisions, asking for at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance and asking to cancel all residential rent and mortgage payments until the emergency is lifted, are not the law right now. We are trying to get it into the next bill, and I think we have a fair shot at doing that. And I do think the next bill will be passed sometime in the next month. Under the CARES Act, homeowners with federally backed mortgages receive, and again, most mortgages are federally backed. So homeowners with federally backed mortgages will receive a 60-day mortgage foreclosure moratorium and are eligible for 6 months forbearance on their payments with a possible 6-month extension without fees, penalties, or extra interest. So the CARES Act helps tenants, puts a moratorium on rent payments, but also helps the landlords who are not getting this income by putting a moratorium on mortgage payments. This forbearance is available to homeowners with mortgages purchased or securitized by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, including reverse mortgages or home equity conversion mortgages, mortgages insured by the Federal Housing Administration, mortgages directly or indirectly guaranteed or insured by the Veterans Administration or the Department of Agriculture, and not particularly relevant to New York, but guaranteed under HUD's Native American or Native Hawaiian Home Loan Guarantee Program. Again, most mortgages fit into one of these categories. So this covers most mortgages. Homeowners should contact their mortgage servicers to determine if they qualify, if those mortgages are under one of these categories, if they are federally guaranteed. Even if they don't, many servicers are voluntarily offering forbearance to their customers, and options are available. Now, we're also looking in the next bill to provide additional housing assistance. Congress has provided significant support to help families who live in public housing or receive housing assistance to stay in their homes throughout this public health crisis benefit. We have already provided $1.25 billion for tenant-based rental assistance, $1 billion for project-based rental assistance, $50 million for Section 202 housing for the elderly, $65 million for HOPWA, $4 billion in emergency solutions grants. which can be used for emergency shelters, homelessness prevention programs, and short-term rental assistance for those at risk of becoming homeless. In the next bill, we're asking, some of us, myself and Congresswoman Meng and Congresswoman Clark, are asking that there be significant increase in funding for public housing in the next bill. And Congresswoman Menendez, Velasquez rather, and I have offered legislation, although I doubt it will get into this bill, but we've offered legislation for $75 billion for basic repairs in public housing. Let me just say one word of caution. People should be wary of third parties offering assistance in accessing any of these benefits. The Federal Trade Commission has information about COVID-19 scams on its website, www.ftc.gov. People should report any suspicious activity to the National Center for Disaster Fraud on their hotline. I'll give you a phone number, but I'll give you an email address. Phone number is 866-720-5721. The email address is disaster@leo.gov. So this is what we've done so far and what we're trying to do in the next bill. It's substantial, but I do think that we're going to need most of it because I don't think this economic crisis or this pandemic is going away anytime soon, unfortunately.
And as I mentioned, we've been working very closely with our congressional delegation and doing everything we can to join them in advocating for really substantial relief for New York. And I think the first rounds of these have been very significant, as the Congressmember notes, but we all understand we have a lot more to do. So we thank you very much for making a cameo here on our town hall and for all the work you're doing in Washington for us every day. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Good. So that was actually a good segue because we are, the Congressmember talked about both issues related to renters as well as homeowners. And we do have we want to get through some questions about homeowners. Obviously, as we noted at the top, homeowners are also having difficulty paying their expenses, including real estate taxes and mortgages. I have Steve from Manhattan who says, why can't New York State require banks and non-bank lenders to provide a 1-year extension on existing mortgages with borrowers just paying 1% of the loan balance during that period so they don't get foreclosed on, and then resume normal payments after that? The short answer is this is similar to a couple of proposals. First of all, as I mentioned, if forbearance is already in place, meaning during this period, the lenders cannot take the normal steps they can when you refuse to pay, when you are unable to pay your mortgage. They can't foreclose and they can't take certain collection steps. But that process is going to, that period is going to come to an end. And the question for a lot of us is what happens next. So we at the state level have been working on a bill that would address the mortgages that are under our jurisdiction, and that includes state chartered banks and also some of the mortgage service companies that are managing mortgages that may have originally been issued by banks that New York State doesn't have control over. And we believe that we have jurisdiction over those. And our proposal is basically to take payments that would have been due during the forbearance, and rather than have them due at the end of the forbearance, have them due at the end of the mortgage. Meaning, if this is ends up being a 6-month period where there's a forbearance, those 6 months of payments would not be collectible during the forbearance period. And if your mortgage goes until 2022, January, your mortgage would be extended until July of 2022, and all of that without interest or penalty. We believe that is something we have the authority to do. Note, it does not cost a lot of federal or state funds to do that. And as has been noted, many banks are not under state jurisdiction, but under federal jurisdiction. And we do have a companion bill introduced by Congressmember Rice in Long Island, who is working with her delegation as well, that would do basically those same steps, but with respect to federal banks. So we do hope that will significantly address the question of how people are going to deal with mortgages during this. I'm going to just try to move on to a couple other topics, unless you guys have something like that. Alejandra from Manhattan asks, why are co-ops and condos being excluded from all the government aid? We are experiencing financial hardship and increased costs in ensuring the safety of residents and staff. So just generally, condos and co-ops are different in various ways. One of the ways is different is that if you are a condo, if you're a co-op owner, you are both an owner of shares in the building you live in the corporation that runs the building you live in, and you also have a lease. So for most purposes in law, co-op owners do count as tenants under landlord-tenant law. And we would expect that to the extent you are unable to pay what is effectively your rent to the co-op, that renter relief would probably apply to you. And we can certainly take steps to make sure that that is the case to the extent that is a burden because you've lost your income. Mortgage relief would likely apply to the other portion of what you did. If you took out a personal mortgage to cover the cost of purchasing the co-op and you're still paying that, mortgage forbearance would apply to that as well. With respect to condos, it's a little trickier. Again, mortgage relief would likely apply. If you're paying fees to co-ops, fees to like a condo fee to the condo itself, those are generally not considered rent, so we'll have to look at how we can address that in provisions of either federal or state law to make sure, again, that the goal is to make sure that nobody loses their home during this crisis. So that is, I think that's like a start on those questions. Obviously, we're still sorting out exactly what the best remedies are for those entities. I don't know if either of you has anything to add to that. Okay. There are questions about property taxes. They're coming due in June. Is any relief being given and or proposed to help relieve the financial pressure of property taxes? Just one note is that property taxes go to local governments for the most part. And that means in New York, of course, to the New York City government, which uses that revenue to provide really basic services. So one part of that is we may need the city, if they want to adjust property taxes, they may need state authorization to do that. And there is a bill that is carried by my colleague, Monica Martinez, that would give states more flexibility to extend and delay tax payments. We're still working in the city. I think the city of New York is really going to have to speak to the question of what they need in terms of flexibility. And also just remember that our city government is paying for some of the most basic services that we rely on every day. So again, it's not a simple answer to just say, let's not have anybody pay their taxes. So relief that goes to renters, that goes to landlords would presumably also go to pay property taxes, as would some of the other relief we're talking about for homeowners. It might make them more able to continue to pay taxes. So again, all these things are related. I don't, as someone who doesn't, I'm not responsible for property taxes directly. I do want to have further conversations with my city colleagues who are sorting out the city budget to figure out how we're going to address property tax as a burden. And we're very aware that it's a burden, and that is a question we've gotten frequently. Again, we have a lot more questions. I'm seeing the chat on maintenance and utilities and taxes and water charges and all those things. We are also looking at solutions for those things. And again, the solution for each of those things may be different, but we are looking at making sure all of the things that go into having a habitable place to live throughout this crisis are addressed. So again, we haven't forgotten those, but I'm going to move on because we are 10 minutes from the end of this segment. And I want to talk a little bit more about homelessness. Again, as was noted at the top of this program, we've been in a homelessness crisis for a long time with far too many people living in congregate settings and in public spaces. And in our district in Chinatown, I think we saw a tremendous tragedy just a few months ago where people living in public spaces were unfortunately subject to a horrible night of violence that led to 4 people being killed who had been living on the street. But COVID has made this crisis much greater because, again, having people live in places where they cannot separate, where they cannot take care of their own health, and in congregate facilities where they are often sharing the kinds of facilities that we've all been told we should not be sharing. We should stay separate from each other for the duration of this to prevent the spread of COVID. So I think it's brought to a head really this question of what we can do with respect to homelessness. So I'm going to go to a question. This is Philip from Manhattan asks, what is being done to expand access to shelter for those experiencing street homelessness during the crisis? And I'm going to combine these just because we're running out of time. Wes from Manhattan asks, as New York City moves to the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. subway cleaning, how are we planning to help the homeless find shelter through outreach workers or NYPD officers? So Josh, maybe you could talk a little bit about the various elements of the service.
Yeah, we have a lot of very serious concerns about what we've heard in the last couple of days about what the city's plan is. It seems like the plan is just to shut down the subways from 1 to 5 a.m., but there's not any new resource being offered to the people who are on the trains in that hour to have a place to go. So people who are sleeping on the trains are going there because they're afraid. They're afraid to go to shelter. They're afraid of being in a congregate setting. And if we want to, I mean, they're telling us that what is already exists is not adequate by taking the drastic step of saying, I'm going to sleep on the subway because that's the place I feel safest. So we want them to come off the street, if we want to get them out of congregate settings, if we want them to be able to isolate and help us all reduce the spread, then we need to have places for them to go. And again, that's why we think the solution is to offer hotel rooms that are currently empty to those folks. There's a GoFundMe campaign that was set up by some advocates that raised enough money to move some people into motels, and they found that they could get very cheap rates at this time, probably $50 a night. And so that seems to be a much more cost-effective solution to the problem than just closing the subways, pushing everyone out into the street. And the same goes for people. There are drop-in centers around the city where people can go and wait during the day, but those places are also very crowded. Similarly, people who have nowhere to go, who are being sent to shelter intake offices, or people who are coming from other places, need a place to go and should just go directly to one of these hotel rooms. It reduces the crowding in the shelters. It will enable those people to isolate themselves and reduce, and that is what we need right now, is for everyone to be able to isolate themselves. It's not as if somebody whose economic circumstances are different has some different susceptibility to the virus. If anything, they're more susceptible. So really we need for everyone to have a place to go, and that applies to every single person in the city of New York, regardless of their circumstances.
And New York City right now could get access to FEMA funds that exist, that are waiting to pay New York City so it doesn't have to use its own resources to put people in hotels. FEMA will reimburse the city if the city asks for it, which as far as we can tell, it has not yet asked.
Yeah, and we that's an issue we've been discussing with the city, and we actually do think there may be some movement on that. It does seem that I think the city was trying to use some funds that are more limited and also maybe available for other housing needs. And so there does seem to be some positive movement on that coming soon. The city, at least from what the city's been saying very lately. What are the shelters doing to ensure safety and health of the staff, clients, and the broader community? My office had some conversations about this, but Josh, do you have a sense of that?
Sure. I mean, I think the issue has been that the city was responding with what seemed like the right plan, but it's been very slow to be implemented. So the idea has been to reduce crowding in shelters, to move out people who are most vulnerable. They've moved out, for instance, everybody who's 70 and older who wanted to go to a hotel room, they got them a room. They recognized that their staff and the clients needed masks and other forms of personal protective equipment. So they ordered that, but everyone has seen what the supply chain issues are there. It's no different for the shelters. In fact, it's probably even worse if you need that kind of equipment in a non-medical setting. The priority has been to deliver that to the first responders reasonably, because they are every day confronting people who are definitely positive. But we all need that. Anybody who's working with other people on a daily basis needs that kind of equipment. So I guess what we've seen is that the goal is there, but implementing it has been very slow.
And what, several questions about what people can do to help constituents who are concerned about this and want to, people said, you know, they understand that people in hotels don't necessarily have access to the services they need, to food and other services, and
Sure.
just more generally questions about how people can help if they're interested in helping.
So all of these new hotels are in effect shelters, and the Coalition for the Homeless is the court-appointed shelter monitor for New York City, and they have been out making sure that the shelters are that these new hotels, style shelters are running properly. Just this evening, I've seen emails going back and forth about ensuring that people have adequate access to food. You know, again, they set up a system very quickly to deliver food, and it hasn't always worked perfectly, which the city acknowledges, but we've been trying to raise those concerns as we find them. So you can certainly reach out to us at Legal Aid, and Coalition for the Homeless, again, is the shelter monitor. They're also out every night feeding people. They have vans that travel around the city on predetermined routes, delivering food to people, and the demand is way up. They've had, you know, twice or even more the regular demand for people to have food every day. So we're definitely seeing an extremely high level of need, and I would encourage people to reach out to Coalition for the Homeless as one organization that definitely could use assistance. You know, they're working with Doctors Without Borders and other organizations in New York City right now to ensure that people have their basic needs met.
Great. And I have a couple questions about people, specifically about whether people wanted to donate personal protective equipment to shelters. Would Coalition for the Homeless also be able to take that and get it to the right place?
Yeah, all of the stakeholders here are in pretty constant communication. And so, yes, I would say if you have something to donate, we can all very quickly figure out where to get it, who needs it the most right now, and how to distribute it.
Great. And I would just note that if you also have questions about donating materials and looking for a place, you could also call our office directly, and we've been able to get some materials and equipment to public housing, to the coalition, also to some of our nursing homes and healthcare institutions. So please also do call our office. Okay, so we are at 7:59 p.m. This segment is supposed to go till 8 o'clock. And then we're gonna, as I noted, jump into a small business segment. But again, just if I wanna, first of all, thank both of you, not only for being with us tonight and offering all of your advice and knowledge about this, but all of your work both of you do all year round to make sure rights are protected and make sure people have the services and the information they need. So thank you both. Either of you have any sort of closing thoughts or anything you want to say before you go?
Just for everyone who's listening, please call your congressional representatives and urge them to include housing assistance, housing and homeless assistance in the next CARES Act. We need money that is supposed to be dedicated specifically to housing to make sure it gets to tenants and unhoused people who are currently suffering.
Gotcha.
Thank you. And I would just ask everyone to please bear in mind again that as long as our fellow New Yorkers are living in any kind of congregate setting, we are going to have a lot of trouble getting past this. And so as you think about what should happen next, think about it as something that we have to solve for everyone, because otherwise we're all going to continue to be in jeopardy. Right.
And I think both of those points are critically important. We really are in many ways in New York as the epicenter of this public health crisis, all very much dependent on each other, day to day to follow public health advice, but also in a long-term way to make sure that we have the resources to get our whole city back on the feet, make sure that people have housing and decent places to live, and make sure we advocate together to get the resources and really in a crisis, a federal government that does not have to balance their budgets in ways that the city and the state does, and has an ability to spend very large amounts of money in a crisis like this, and has done so historically many times before. Really an advocacy effort to make sure that message is loud and clear, and that if you're concerned about housing, that your Congress members are hearing from you that housing has to be a critical part of that. is really important. So thank you, Ellen, for making that point. And thank you again, Josh, for being with us tonight and all of your input and work. Okay, so we're going to close this segment out, and I am going to take a step off camera for about 10 seconds, and then we're going to come back with our next segment here on small businesses. So thank you all, thank the two of you, and thank you all for your patience who have been waiting for our next hot topic. But thank you. We'll be right back. I want to make sure before we begin, we have both of our next panelists on. I see Andrew Flam. Do we have the commissioner on? Okay, I'm looking at my chat box to see if somebody can confirm that the commissioner is here with us. Okay, the commissioner is joining us, but I think maybe since we're trying to keep to a tight schedule here, it is 8:02 p.m. Thank you again to all of you who have been waiting patiently for the small business segment of our program tonight. Again, this is, for those of you who may be just tuning in at 8, this is a 2-hour panel discussion. The first segment, we learned a great deal about housing and homelessness and New York's needs and how we're hoping to address them. We're now going to shift into a conversation about small business needs, which again has been a very significant source of concern on the part of our constituents, and we get lots of requests on this. Again, if you have additional questions about either our first program on housing and homelessness or during the course of this, you can reach out to our office. The phone number again is 212-298-5565. And the email address is Kavanagh, Kavanagh, at nysenate.gov. And we're always, every day, ready to hear from you and help address your concerns. And I see we've been joined by the commissioner. So welcome, Commissioner Bishop. So again, this is going to be a conversation about the resources, the concerns small businesses are having, and the resources that might be available. This has obviously been a topic that has been developing over time. The federal government took some steps to make some very substantial resources available. Some of those programs ran out very quickly, and there have now been additional allocations of money. But at the end of the day, it is often the state and the city government, and particularly in New York, the city government, that has to implement those. So we're very happy to have with us Greg Bishop, who's Commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services. And we also have with us Andrew Flam, who serves as Director of the Pace University Small Business Development Center, which provides a free high-impact consulting and training to small business owners all year round. But obviously, there's been a lot of small business owners that need advice and counsel and expertise to deal with this. So we're very happy to have him with us as well. Let me just begin by saying welcome. And if each of you might want to just give us a few words on kind of what your role is with respect to small businesses and what you see as kind of the top line of things people should be thinking about in that area. And why don't we start with you, Commissioner Bishop?
All right, so thanks for having me. I want to make sure the audio, everybody can hear me. Great.
I can hear you well.
All right, fantastic. So good evening, everyone, and it's great to be here. And of course, I want to thank Senator Kavanagh for putting this event together. And I also want to thank Andrew for joining me on this panel. It's always good to see you, Andrew. As you know, this has been it's been a challenging situation for all our small businesses, but with your partnership, engagement, and leadership, we'll be able to reach New Yorkers, whether they're business owners or job seekers who need our help. And of course, conversations like these are very important. We had a number of, I think, programs that we've been helping our small businesses. So as you know, we started off with our own local program, which we were able to stand up a loan and grant program but the demand quickly exceeded our ability to really meet the true demand of all our New York City small businesses. So at the Department of Small Business Services, we pivoted a lot of our resources to help businesses connect with the Paycheck Protection Program and also with the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. We see the federal government coming in with the resources that is necessary to not only meet demand, but also help our small businesses. There's a couple things I know that we'll talk about with the PPP, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One, applications are open now. So we need to make sure that anyone that's on this conference, if you have not applied yet, please get your applications in. If you're unclear on how to do that, we do have technical assistance to help you not only understand how to, what paperwork is necessary, but which lenders are participating, because that's another issue that we've heard. I know we'll have some questions about that. I do want to touch on two other things really quickly. One is rent, and I know there's legislation in Albany, and we're thinking about legislation here at the city level. But until then, we want to make sure that you have the resources in terms of free attorneys. We have been able to provide free attorneys for landlords, for businesses to negotiate with their landlords. So please be proactive in contacting your landlord, and if you need assistance. We also have free attorneys for those who have business interruption insurance and may have tried to file a claim and may not have been successful. We have attorneys that will be able to look at your policy and help you figure out how to file that claim. And last but not least, and then I know we'll turn over to discussion, is, at this moment in time, so many people are looking for assistance, but unfortunately we have unscrupulous individuals who are using this time to capture your private information and use it for nefarious purposes. So please only respond to emails from trusted individuals. Do not click on any links. If you get any calls, unless it's coming from someone that you've been in touch with for assistance, please use extra caution. And if you're going to any government site, make sure it ends with .gov. Happy to continue the conversation and talk about some of the things about the PPP and the things that we're advocating for. But it's good to be here for this conversation.
Good, and Commissioner Bishop, just so you weren't here for the first segment, but we've gotten about 250 questions combined for both panels in advance of this. We've tried to summarize them. I have a big stack, and we're also on a chat getting questions live as we go. So we've been trying to sort of filter those in as well and keep this interactive. But thank you. That was an excellent sort of starting point for our conversation. And Andrew, do you want to just add anything about sort of generally the landscape for people? I think you're muted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, terrific. Senator Kavanagh, I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel and your leadership in kind of helping, pull this, very important topic together in terms of helping support small businesses here in New York City. And Commissioner Bishop's a great leader, and it's an honor to be with you on this panel. So I appreciate everything that you and your colleagues at SBS have been doing. So you're a great partner and a terrific guy. So
thank you.
I just wanted to touch briefly on, Commissioner Bishop sort of touched on some of the key federal programs. I think just to reiterate in terms of the Paycheck Protection Program, this is really kind of an excellent opportunity, I think, for businesses to be able to access funding through the federal government. This program offers up to 8 weeks of payroll, plus an additional 25% of that amount to be able to help businesses reopen. It's effectively giving what is a low interest loan that would be forgivable if we're able to kind of get all these folks back on payroll. So I think it's really kind of a great opportunity. As the Commissioner touched on, and as the Senator touched on as well, demand has really far outstripped the funding for these programs. But I think the ability and the fine tuning in the second tranche with respect to kind of helping community-based institutions be able to get some of their clients through, I think has really been very helpful, I think, in terms of helping both support the important work that community-based community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and other alternative lenders to kind of help them support the small business clients that they work with on a day in, day out basis. There are a number of additional federal programs that are in place. Hopefully some of you on the call have participated in or are getting some support through the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. There are modest advances that are available through this program amounting to $1,000 per employee, up to a 10-employee maximum. And we've started to see some clients kind of get these advances in some of the loans coming through this program. Unfortunately, there is a hold given the backlog. So the SBA, I should kind of back up to say, this particular program is being processed directly by the Small Business Administration. This is a program that they've used and launched for other disasters, whether it's, Sandy or 9/11 here in New York, or other hurricanes and things like that, Katrina and others elsewhere throughout the country. Oftentimes it's a very regional focus in terms of the impact. But given the 50 state and territory impact, for what's happening in our economy right now, clearly there's so much demand for these programs. So I think in terms of challenges, we want to make sure, and the Congressmember Nadler, I think, has been a great advocate, and his colleagues in the New York constituency about kind of getting focus on how to get more funding available for these federal programs to help make sure small businesses are supported here in New York. There are some other programs I guess we can touch on as we go further into the call as well, both federal programs that are in place, as well as some private support through the private sector, whether they're grants, low interest loans, and other advertising credits and so forth that we've been encouraging our clients to take advantage of.
Great. So a couple of questions from constituents. I'm gonna try to combine a couple of them just so we can try to get through as many as we can during the course of the hour. But so Joan in Manhattan asks, is there someone who can provide me guidance on the PPP application and what forms I may need? Do I need a lender or a bank to apply? And Erica, also in Manhattan, says, which lenders are processing PPP applications for small businesses and actually prioritizing them?
Yeah, so great questions. And I would say that between Andrew and I and our respective agencies, we both can help you. So we have a sample application on our website. So if you go to nyc.gov/COVID-19-BIZ, I'll put it in the chat so folks can return to it. That's nyc.gov/COVID-19-BIZ. You'll get a link to the actual application. If you have questions about the documentation, we provide webinars where we'll walk through the application and explain what each documentation means and what you need to provide. And because every business is so nuanced, if you have additional questions, we'll then connect you for a one-on-one session. You do have to go through a lender. So that is one of the challenges. I mean, when you think about the infrastructure, it's great that they used as many lenders as possible to get to as many businesses as possible. But it does require you to have a business bank account with a particular lender. If you have a personal bank account, then you're not eligible. However, there are lenders that are accepting new clients. So you'll have to create a business bank account with those lenders. We can connect you to that lender, or you can go to SBA's website. It's sba.gov/Paycheck Protection Program. Put in your location and you'll find lenders that are not only participating, but accepting new applications.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna, unless Andrew, so I'm gonna jump to the next question. So I have David from Manhattan says, as a recipient of a small PPP loan as of 2 weeks ago, how do I reconcile the rules and restrictions of the PPP loan to begin 8 weeks from when the loan is allocated, when the extended stay-at-home laws have been extended at least until May 15th, which leaves a very tight time frame to rehire my employees and utilize it as in full for loan forgiveness. And I would note there's just a more general question about sort of getting things up and running. This is Jane, who asks, until there's a clear safety protocols established by industry on how to operate safely for workers and customers, it'd be hard for them to get back on their feet. How is a dentist supposed to conduct business as normal safety? A nail salon, a restaurant, they're essential businesses. we've seen that have chosen to close because they were worried about safety, because owners often work side by side with workers. How can we help get their own PPP cleaning services and protocol if a positive case is found, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit how those PPP programs intersect with this question of we're still in quite a substantial shutdown, and then do you have thoughts on or things that people should be advocating for in terms of getting back up and running?
Yeah, I do. And there's a number of things that I'm advocating for. I've been talking to our New York Congressional Delegation in terms of the challenges with the PPP. The program itself is not necessarily a great program for New York businesses. And here's why. There's two major flaws with it. And then there's one other area that I've been advocating for. The first flaw is exactly right, what the question asked, which is that once you get the loan, you have 8 weeks to return your staffing levels to pre-COVID levels. And as you know, New York on pause is still happening right now until May 15th. So that's a huge disadvantage for our small businesses here in New York City. And even then, the question about what is the once we start reopening, we're going to reopen in phases. So there is a universe, and there's when you look at the fact that individuals, social distancing will be a thing for at least the next 6 months. A restaurant may not see the same volume, so it might be impossible for them to return to their full staffing levels by June. So we are advocating at least by the end of December for them to be able to return to their levels. We're also advocating the percentage. Right now, in order for the loan to be forgiven, 75% of that loan has to be used for payroll, and you only have 25% left for other expenses. And as you know, in New York City, we think a 50-50 split is ideal, for in terms of you can use 50% of that loan for other things besides payroll. So, and the third thing we're advocating for, which is to address what we saw the problems with the first round, which is a lot of our small businesses in New York City, almost 70% of our businesses across the city have fewer than 10 employees. And their average loan requests are usually $70,000 to $80,000. So why did I tell you that? Meaning a lot of our small businesses, they don't have a banking relationship, or they don't bank with some of the big banks. So they were left out. Now, in this round of the PPP, our smaller lenders and also our CDFIs, which is our Community Development Financial Institutions, there was a set aside of $60 billion. But we are still pushing for CDFIs only to have a set aside. So that way they are competing with their peers. Because there are some smaller businesses, to the previous question, where they're going to need help. They're going to need hand-holding to put the application together. And when you have a first come, first served model, it only helps big business.
Andrew, or should we move on to the next one? Oh, okay.
Sorry, Andrew.
No, that's good. Thorough, succinct answers are appreciated. I'm sure we'll all have enough opportunity to talk. I want to just, another thing on loans and grant programs. This is Mama Diala. I hope I'm not butchering your name, but from Brooklyn. Says, how can we be approved for small business loans and grants if our workers are subcontractors who are paid in cash?
Do you want to take that?
For the PPP program, because the independent contractors have the opportunity to apply on their own, so they're effectively individual businesses as well. So there was the thought from the federal government perspective is they wanted to make sure that everybody had their own firm but had the opportunity to apply. So with that respect, I guess that would be the thought process. Again, it's not my design of the program. I'm just trying to kind of get to what the thought process was in terms of pulling it together. Ultimately, lenders, whether it's part of this process or in more calm and normal times, are going to look at what the cash flow of the business is, and whether you're working with the business advisor through our center or one of the range of my colleagues throughout the state, or through one of the small business solution centers here in the city as well. I mean, a lot of the focus is going to be on how to make sure that you have a full sense of kind of what the operations are from a financial perspective in terms of revenues coming in, and being able to accurately reflect what the costs are, so you can be able to provide an assessment and provide kind of evidence to a lender or a stakeholder or an investor in terms of what the true accurate reflection is. So I'm not sure. The short answer is I think working with the business advisor to kind of help come up with some projections and be able to formalize some of those processes, I think would be of great benefit.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions about, I'm not going to try to summarize, but we have a lot of questions about rent. So just for example, what can a one-person business paying over $10,000 a month in rent with no revenue do? I don't make enough money to be eligible, as the bank has already told me I would need an income of $75,000 to qualify for a minimum loan. Another example of this is a business owner from Brooklyn who says we can't pay commercial rents while we have no revenue and we did not receive a PPP loan. My landlord still wants to be paid so she can pay her own bills. What resources are available for small business owners who receive no assistance?
Yeah, so I mean, rent is obviously the number one. Between rent and labor costs, it's the two major expenses for any small business in New York City. And right now, a number of businesses are concerned about, April, they might have been able to make rent, but for sure, May is tomorrow, and they may not be able to. My advice, this is a very complicated situation. You have some of the smaller landlords, because of the trickle down, they have a mortgage to pay. So what I've been telling the small landlords is go to your lender, go to your mortgage servicer and request a forbearance. A lot of companies are doing that right now, where they're deferring payments for up to 90 days. That will then bring relief for your tenants because you want to keep your tenants. And for the businesses that are having problems with their landlord, and unfortunately I've heard stories about landlords not being communicative, not answering calls, etc. We will offer you a free attorney to try to help with the negotiation. At the very least, you should have an attorney to look at your lease, to understand your rights and responsibilities on that lease. The City of New York, we do have a commercial tenant harassment law. So there are certain things that the landlord cannot do. And of course, right now, there's a moratorium on evictions, et cetera. But we know once the economy starts going again, you're going to have to figure out at least 2 or 3 months of back rent. And that is one of the things I've been pushing for different sources of capital to help our small businesses when they get to that point. But for right now, we will be offering free attorneys for assistance.
And I think having that capital is such a crucial point. I think that Greg had referenced, looking at some of the community-based lenders, thinking about lines of credit, to potentially kind of have some cash flow in place to help develop these relationships. So to kind of get you back on your feet until, some of the business that was there previously returns. I also put into the chat box, we've been tracking, there's a wide range of, I think I mentioned kind of briefly in my initial remarks, kind of grants, low and 0% interest loans, and various advertising credits and so forth from various private sector sources that you may want to take advantage of. It's not an answer to everybody. Clearly, there's limited financing and limited funds available here as well. But where possible, these are kind of good things to be able to tack onto. These are one-time arrangements where I think kind of the relationships with community-based lenders, I think where they have greater capacity and kind of a mission-driven to be able to address and incorporate inherent risk that's involved in small business. I think this is what they're there for. They're here to support you and help you build and grow. And, New York City is blessed with a number of terrific organizations that meet this criteria.
Great. So, Commissioner, if somebody's looking for that assistance with attorney, they can just go to your website and get information about how to connect with that service.
Yeah, absolutely.
Questions about attorney access.
One of my staff, Miguelina, she's on this chat right now. Just drop the URL in the chat. So it's nyc.gov/comlease, and you just fill out a form. fill out what the issue is, what language you'd. We work with a number of lawyers across the city, and we've also partnered with City Bar. So there's a number of attorneys that are offering pro bono legal services at this moment. And kudos to just the legal, our legal system here. And when I say legal system, like all our lawyers who have risen to the challenge to help our small businesses.
Great. We usually do these forums in a very public setting, face-to-face with our constituents. I'm going to, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm going to read the following question as written, and it is from someone who identifies themselves as Carissa, and it is business interruption insurance has not paid out a single dollar to New York City restaurants, and the senator has been silent on what he is working on in regards to this. So that's one version of that question. I also got somebody just more generally, I have questions about my business interruption insurance coverage. Can someone review my policy to see if I am covered? So let me take the first part. We have been in touch with a lot of business owners and restaurant owners and all kinds of owners about this question of the extent to which business interruption insurance is going to be a useful tool for people. Generally speaking, what we've heard is that insurance policies as written are not being honored as covering this particular circumstance. We are trying to figure out what we can do legislatively. I chair the Housing Committee, and I've spent a lot of time trying to develop proposals that support and that we can get in the federal government. I don't know if we're. Can you folks still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, you can. Good. I had okay. For apologies at home, I had something across my screen that said you are muted, so I wanted to make sure I'm not. But we've had, we're trying to figure out if there's something we can do to change that circumstance legislatively, and our insurance committee and many of my colleagues are working on that. And in the meantime, we've been fielding calls and trying to get people at least a lot of information about what is currently available. And to those who haven't heard from me directly, I apologize. My staff and I have been working around the clock on these things, and I've been returning calls directly as well where I can. But please be patient with us. And again, thank you for the question. Thoughts on business interruption insurance?
That is, and thank you for that. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that in terms of the State Department of Financial Services. I've been lobbying and talking to our congressional delegation because I think that is spot on. A number of businesses have spent a number of years paying their premiums just for this moment. And we know that a lot of business interruption insurance has a clause for bacteria and virus that makes it exempt. But I feel that an industry that has over $800 billion in assets should be able to be a partner with our small businesses at this moment. I'm not advocating for complete coverage because you don't want to bankrupt the entire industry because that has other unintended consequences. But at least some percentage where our small businesses can get not only capital from government, capital from banks, but capital from their insurance companies to make them whole. So I'm going to continue pushing for a solution, some type of agreement where this is a covered event with limits to protect the insurance industry, but also to make sure that our small businesses get a fair share. They've been paying their premiums, and this is the reason why they pay their premiums for just this moment. And so I would say shame on the industry for hiding behind these clauses. This is a pandemic. None of us have gone through this before. So that is something that I'm very passionate about, as you can tell, and we'll continue to have conversations and push for not only a solution. We've done this before with 9/11. There was a fund that was created in 9/11 damages were legislated as a covered event. So there's precedence. We just need to have a smart solution to make sure that we help protect not only the industry, but then help our small businesses.
And you and I think haven't had an opportunity to discuss this directly, but I know we've been in touch with folks from the city and also with the state DFS, and we are again trying to figure out what whether there's any way we can nudge the industry in the right direction.
Sure.
some kind of a mechanism to handle that fund. So I would like to continue to get any direct thoughts you have on that as we move forward with that, and perhaps put you in touch with our insurance committee folks and staff as well.
Yep, I'd appreciate that.
Andrew, anything to add on business interruption insurance?
Yeah, I think it was well said. I mean, I think the ability and importance of figuring out alternate means of financing, the continued existence of small businesses, obviously we'd support. So, Commissioner's right on the money.
Great. Okay, we have someone named Stan. I don't have a geographic location there. I work at home. My home is not closed, so I did not qualify for PUA. Yet I have no income because everyone else is closed. Doesn't actually turn that into a question, but I think the question is implicit. Is that a correct interpretation of somebody in that circumstance who has a home business, or are there resources available?
So I believe they're talking about unemployment insurance. So for someone who works from home, if you're a sole proprietor or independent contractor, you actually are eligible for both. So you can apply for if you have, you can apply for the PPP if you, hopefully you're not commingling your funds. If you are, then, we can sort of see what you're doing and let you know whether or not you're eligible. But you could also apply for unemployment insurance to then help cover your personal expenses, and the PPP costs and PPP loan will help cover your business expense.
Great. And I think this might be a related question. It's from, I think, someone named Sivan. And again, I apologize, it's S-I-V-A-N. I am both a self-employed consultant with a 1099 and restaurant bar owner with shifts. I work on the floor of my places and live off my tips as well as my freelance consulting jobs. I applied for unemployment and PPE. I just received approval for PPE and have not heard back from unemployment. Can I take advantage of both if both come through, or do I have to pick one?
No, you can take advantage of both. And the PPP, congratulations. As you know, a lot of folks are still waiting. Unemployment, I know, Senator Kavanagh, the Department of Labor has been working tirelessly. This is unprecedented. Again, our systems were never meant to handle the complete shutdown of commerce nationwide. Unemployment in general, if you think about the concept of unemployment, this was something that was brought up in the 1900s to appease like individuals and I think unions, et cetera. It was never meant to be a solution for millions and millions and millions of people. So the system crashed, and I want to give credit to the Department of Labor for moving quickly and pivoting. So I'm assuming they'll get to you. They have a new system, but I'm sure the senator can assist there if you still have not heard from them.
Yeah, so this is an issue. As the commissioner noted, that system really was never designed for. Well, it certainly wasn't prepared for a massive influx of people seeking unemployment simultaneously, and especially with a new program. Initially, they were running the new enhanced program as a separate application process. A lot of my colleagues, we've written a few times now to express the real concern we had as those programs were rolled out initially, and with suggestions for how to improve them. Those are available on our nysenate.gov website. But it is, I think, although it's still a very urgent and serious issue, and many people are still waiting and still having trouble getting through, the state has put 1,000 new people behind the process of reaching out and processing applications. But if you have concerns about your application or need assistance getting through to that program, you can call our office directly or email us, and we have been helping dozens and dozens of people get their application on track there. So, but it is important. And again, for many business owners, that distinction between being an employee and being a business owner is a fine line. There may be people who are being both, as the last question has. So that's an important resource for people. We had a lot of questions about rent, and we talked about this, alluded this a little bit earlier. But are there, so there have been proposals to, we talked about this quite a bit on the housing segment of this, but there are proposals to cancel rent entirely. There are this is Allison in Manhattan says, what provisions are being made for landlords when a retail tenant closed by COVID does not pay rent? We face real estate taxes soon. Can there be a deferral on taxes? Can you just talk a little bit more about, the sort of desirability of various options there? The relationship between the tenant who's paying the rent, who may or may not be able to pay rent, what their options are, and then of course some of our business owners are landlords as well, who are collecting rent and also trying to pay their taxes. Do you have thoughts on how we should sort of balance those different interests?
Yeah, I think you need a multi-pronged approach, and that's why I've been focused a lot on addressing the capital issue for our small businesses. So whether it's making the proper adjustments to the PPP to make sure that our small businesses are connected, putting pressure on the banks. I've said time and time again, the banks were bailed out in 2008, and now is their time to give back to our small businesses. They don't have to wait for a federal guarantee. They can actually create their own capital program to get that capital to our smallest of businesses. So I'm asking them, I'm putting pressure on them to, let's see what you are bringing to the table as well. And I also, again, back to the insurance industry needs. So that's how do we get capital to smaller businesses? And again, I know that the landlords, they have to pay their mortgages, and then, it's a trickle effect, and the mortgages are combined with mortgage securities, et cetera. So we want to make sure that for the landlords, that our connection and our focus is really on your relationship with the bank. And what we've seen is that most landlords, if they're proactive and they speak to their bank, most banks are for bearing their mortgages for at least 90 days. So we hope that for the smaller landlords, they've actually tried to connect with their banks. One of the things that the mayor has been pushing for, as in terms of solution, like what happened in New Jersey, where allowing landlords to use a security deposit for rent. That is something I think more about, Senator. But there are conversations in terms of like, how do we solve this? But for me, it's really, let's get the capital to our small businesses, because that's going to be where they need that help to then help the rest of the ecosystem. And then let's figure out, put pressure on the banks to give some relief not only to the landlords, but also to our small businesses as well.
And clearly there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. So the landlord wants the business to succeed, because if the business succeeds, they're paying rent, and it's, feeds into also kind of more vibrant and viable, commercial districts and the communities that we all live in. So I think there's a great benefit, and obviously, what Commissioner Bishop said kind of makes a whole lot of sense. The one additional piece I'll add in terms of funding support, something that's not really gotten a lot of coverage with respect to the federal allocations, because all of it is really about the focus on recovery programming. The Small Business Administration, the SBA, has a number of programs in place where, through federal guarantees, both large scale as well as community-based lenders are making loans to small businesses. And there is a program that the SBA has put in place in terms of providing debt relief, effectively covering and making sure that principal and interest payments are waived for a 6-month period. So if you're in a position where you have, I guess there was a great deal of talk on the housing side in terms of, forbearance and kind of forgiveness. I mean, this is effectively a program that provides that opportunity for businesses that both have SBA loans in place, as well as there's a window through which small businesses can secure SBA loans right now and have a number of months through which they'll be able to get that opportunity as well. So as we start to transition, and a lot of the businesses that we're working with are transitioning from, how do I keep my lights on, to, things are starting to trickle in, business is starting to pick up a little bit, what can I do to kind of minimize my cost structure as we're proceeding with business, not as usual, because that's not going to be for a while, but it's in this new reality. What do we do? And thinking about programs like this that can help business owners look at ways to kind of keep their overhead down so they can kind of get themselves on firmer footing.
Great. I have a question that says, could you please discuss S8140A? And this is a state bill, and what landlords and tenants can do to advocate for it. Tenants need help and landlords do too. A voucher system would help everyone. This is actually one of my bills, so a question asking a politician to discuss a bill to sponsor is always welcome. I will note we did talk about that quite a bit on the previous segment, which is about housing, but obviously housing often involves somebody who's a business owner who is the landlord who's business is providing housing. So we are working on a proposal that would create a program to pay the rent of residential tenants. And we're also considering options for commercial tenants, and I'll get back to that in a second. But S8140 is a bill that would pay residential rent. It will require a substantial amount of federal money, and the federal CARES Act, the actions they've taken so far have been significant, but have been relatively light on assistance for housing relative to other sectors of our economy. So we are advocating, my colleagues and I have gotten together and advocated for a $100 billion national program for the country for housing, and of which we would hope New York might get $10 billion of that. We think that would go a long way toward actually paying the rent directly, and then put that money in, first of all, make tenants whole, and also put pay the bills of landlords, some of whom, of course, are commercial and residential. With respect to commercial rent, it is a little more complicated because obviously some of these programs that the federal government is already funding and some of the programs we've discussed here tonight are available for payroll as well as other expenses. So we're trying to figure out whether there's a different mechanism we can do at the state level to assist with rent, which, as the commissioner noted earlier, is one of the two biggest expenses for most of our businesses. So thank you for that question. And the biggest way to advocate for that, if you're interested, especially in the residential, is to contact your member of Congress and tell them, and we had one of our members of Congress, Jerry Nadler, on earlier, but tell them that it is critical that the next stimulus, the CARES Act, whatever number we're up to at this point, some people are calling it 3.5 or 4, but that the next bill really does address the dire need for money to help people pay their rent. I don't know if either of you has anything to add to that topic. I know we've talked about rent a little bit. We've talked a lot about banks that have obligations here. We've had a couple of people ask, is there any way I'm going to ask this in both directions. Is there any way to get banks not to hold it against homeowners and landlords if they have forbearance? And I'll also talk about business owners with commercial mortgages. And also, someone asked, is there a way to highlight the small banks that are doing, Commissioner, I assume you can't recommend a particular bank to anybody tonight, but is there a way to talk about how the banks have responded to this? And are there banks that are doing this well? If somebody's looking for a bank, are there factors they should be considering? Or is there a way for somebody to determine whether a bank is performing particularly well or particularly poorly in this environment?
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what Andrew says, but I could tell you that I've been very disappointed with the way the banks handled the first round of the PPP. I get it. One of the things when you think about the infrastructure, banks are making money off of these loans, right? So I think some of them have made, over $6 billion because of the fees, et cetera, that the feds are paying. And these are 100% guaranteed loans. So I know there are some banks, and of course I can't name them, but you can just do a quick Google and see some banks are actually the fees that they've made off of these loans, they're reinvesting into CDFIs because what they're addressing is the liquidity issue that a lot of our CDFIs have at our smaller banks. Our smaller banks have weaker balance sheets, so that's why they can't lend as much as they want to because they need capital. So I would say that the bigger banks, unfortunately, I think with the press and the media, and they've been shamed. So hopefully they do the right thing and process some of the smaller businesses' applications. But the SBA has enacted things to make sure that smaller banks get through. So yesterday, and this was unprecedented, and this may be too in the weeds, but everyone is hitting one system to get your applications through, to get that approval from the SBA. And that system has crashed over the course of time. And yesterday, what the SBA did was, we're not accepting any applications from any bank unless you have a network, your capitalization is under $1 billion. They've never done that before. So the advice I will give someone is, if you have not applied yet, actually don't look at a big bank. Look at your community bank in your neighborhood. And if you need to find one, Andrew or my team can help you find one that's participating.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think I would suggest, before yesterday, I would say if you have a relationship with a commercial lender, I would encourage you to pursue that. I guess I would not necessarily shy away from that advice still. So I think they may be able to shepherd you through the process. But I think Commissioner Bishop is spot on. I think the ability yesterday is really for these alternate lenders to be able to have an opportunity to get some of their clients through the process to, that the system would be able to accept it, I think is, to me, heartening. I think is really an opportunity to spread, the economic benefits of this program to a wider constituency. So there are a number, as I said earlier, I guess there are a number of community-based organizations. I don't feel comfortable promoting a specific one, but I will put into the chat, we have a link of some of the stronger ones here in New York City that we work with. I think these are almost without exception, ones that I think, are terrific. So again, I think New York City, more than many cities, has community-based institutions that are strong, that are committed to the communities that they're serving. And I think, would be a good prospect to explore, for this program.
Yeah, and so, sorry, two things. One, I think there's something to be said, and I see it in the chat. We also have to advocate for those that may not be able to pay their rent, may not be able to, pay their mortgage. We know that, this country is built on credit, and your credit score, you live and die by your credit score. A lot of our CDFIs and our smaller lenders, they look beyond the credit score for just that reason. But we also need to make sure that our reporting agencies, and that might be something that we talk about as well, do not use this opportunity to penalize individuals who are experiencing hardship. So I certainly am supportive of that. And I think that is something that we need to certainly look at.
Right, and we thank you for that. And we are looking at many ways to ensure that during this period, there's not long-term harm to people on credit scores, on other aspects of their financial kind of wherewithal. One thing I would note, and again, we did speak about this in the housing context, but it also applies in the commercial context. We are looking to add to the forbearance on mortgages that, under current law, people can't foreclose. They can't take certain actions during the forbearance period. But under current law, those mortgage payments will become due at the end of the forbearance. So we have legislation that we're certainly working on the residential side, but also on the commercial side, to say that those payments, rather than being due in the forbearance end, they would be due at the end of the mortgage. So if your mortgage is expiring, your final payment is currently January 2030, and we have a 5-month forbearance now, we basically extend your mortgage to June 2030 without penalty or interest accruing during that period. And we have some ability to address that with state institutions, the state banks, and mortgage companies here. And again, we're working with Congresswoman Kathleen Rice on that. Somebody asked in the chat, I think, is there an ability to determine whether their mortgage is whether their mortgage is held by a state institution or a federal institution? Do either of you have?
Ooh. I don't know. I think there's, in terms of your mortgage, and now I'm dating myself. I know Fannie and Freddie, are sort of like the federal entities that hold all the mortgages. And so I actually don't know. So unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that question.
And someone in our chat is suggesting ACRIS. may have that, which is an online database. And I think
Oh, Fannie Mae.
Yes, and if you have a question, we may also be able to identify, if you want to call our office, we do actually have lists of state institutions, but I don't have that information at my fingertips now. But if you have a particular question about your mortgage and whether, as I mentioned, there are provisions, there's a federal forbearance and a different state provisions that are similar but may have some differences. So if you have particular questions about that and you want us to help track that down, you could call our office as well about that. Andrew, did you want to jump in or? Okay. Okay, we have a question. This is a worried business owner with regard to a very specific question about her rights. Can my landlord hold my goods hostage if I can't pay rent when it's time to reopen?
So again, this is the commercial tenant harassment bill. There are certain things that the landlords can't do in terms of intimidation. So we want to make sure that depending on what your lease says, so I'm not able to answer that particular question because if your lease says that the landlord can blah, 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 for collateral, they may be within their rights. But the most important thing is that if you have an attorney, have your attorney look at your lease and then they'll be able to give you the answer. If you don't, we can provide you that attorney for free to help you get the answer. And if they are violating that commercial tenant harassment law, then that attorney will then take the next step to make sure that the landlord knows that they're in violation of that. I know I've been looking through the chat. I know folks have been saying about the business interruption that they have attorneys. The reason why our businesses were shut down was because of our executive order. We did add in our executive order the threat of physical damage. So that is one of the languages that we think if you have an attorney that can look at your policy and look at the executive order, they can make a case that that is what you're filing a claim against. But I've heard so many times that it doesn't matter the fact that we shut down, the government shut down businesses. If you try to make a claim with your insurance company, they're going to say it's because of the bacteria and virus why the government shut down the businesses. Therefore, this is not a claim that we will honor. So we just want to make sure that you have the fine eyes of an attorney to figure out how to actually go through this while we talk about the bigger picture in terms of the industry itself, contributing to the recovery.
And thank you for that. That's also that's an explanation we've heard as well. But again, all of these things are specific to your policy and your circumstance. So it is important to have an attorney look at that as well. I have a question. This is from Lee, and it is in the chat. But any suggestions for support to help small businesses to work toward opening? I'm a landlord and trying to get my tenants who run a cafe come up with a way to plan for a potential reopening and to come up with a new business game plan. I'm trying to work with them on their needs holistically, but they are pretty much just in shock and scared and closed. Maybe there are talks I could send them. So can you speak to that, the sense of like rethinking and kind of getting the courage to get out there again?
Yeah, I could start, and I'm sure, Andrew, in terms of what you're hearing from businesses. So the mayor announced a task force, and on those task forces, a number of different sectors. One of them is small business. We will have small business owners in various different, the restaurant industry, et cetera, retail, all the different categories. And that's the main purpose of that task force, is to hear from business owners some of the challenges, and the associations, some of the challenges that our small businesses will have when we reopen. Challenges like, if I have a certain amount of space and I have to still maintain social distance, what does, if I'm entering into a business and if I'm exiting a business, what does that look like? How do I have to reconfigure my cafe to make sure that I have social distancing? Our transportation committee is thinking about how do we effectively use the streets? If one of the things that I would encourage business owners to do is look at other cities and look at other countries, other cities in other countries, because you'll get an idea of some of the challenges. Consumer behavior, people may not want to actually go out. People may not want to be in a crowded area. So you need to figure out, how do I maybe still have pickup where it's still no contact? because until people feel safe health-wise, so that means we have rapid testing, we know how to isolate, and of course, until the vaccine, I think you're going to see a change in consumer behavior. So you will have to adapt your business for that change.
Yeah, and the business adaptation is exactly right. I feel like the things that I would add to that are kind of thinking about what an amended business model might look like. So if you had 50 chairs in your restaurant previously, and you can now only accommodate 20 based on spacing issues, how are you amending your business model? Are you going to be shifting some of your marketing efforts towards maybe catering, small scale events, whatever that might look like? Are you going to think more about how to become more focused on takeout or delivery? Maybe you haven't done that before. So I think a lot of the things the commissioner touched on, I think, are really about kind of re-envisioning what the business would be and how it's going to operate. And I think the benefits that meeting with business advisors from the New York State Small Business Development Center network, our centers at PACE, or meeting with somebody through one of the business solution centers, I think being able to talk through what this is going to look like, both operationally and then what kind of the corresponding financials are going to look like. So, if there's change in cash flow requirements, change in equipment and purchasing, and you may have specific purchases you have to do to be able to retrofit your space for some of these items. There's a whole, it really kind of pulls together a lot of the operational and financial challenges, and being able to make sure that you thought this through and be able to connect with somebody that, handles and kind of works on this on a day in, day out basis. And again, all the services that we collectively offer are available at no cost. So we would just, certainly encourage your tenant and any other small business on the phone, to connect with one of the centers to be able to work through some of these operational challenges.
I did enjoy, there was a piece, I think it was in the Times, about these restaurants that had sort of almost spontaneously started offering baskets of ingredients that are sort of along the theme of their restaurant, and basically converting into kind of specialty grocery stores, even as they're taking some takeout orders. So obviously there's tremendous creativity in the New York business community, especially in restaurants, but also in many other sectors. So, but it is, that's very, I think, very helpful advice for people, and it is going to take a lot of adjustment in all aspects of our lives. We are at 8:58. We promised a 9 p.m. wrap up for this. So I'm just going to ask one more question from the board, which is, Commissioner, you mentioned that advisory process the mayor was putting together. Someone wants to know if they want to know more about that, or perhaps volunteer to give advice or assist people. Is there some way people can engage in that way?
Yeah, so we submitted names to the task force already, but if someone is interested, have them send the contact information to you, and we can see if there's any opportunity, at least for them to give some type of, their ideas that we will float. I serve on the committee as well, so happy to talk to that person to understand some of the things that they have. And of course, I just want to, because I know we're almost at time, say that this is a trying time for all of us. This is, for business owners, you're anxious about your business. We're anxious about our families. We're anxious about the community. We're anxious about everything. So we are also partnering up with Thrive NYC to provide that support. Now is a time that if you've never had someone to talk to, because I know a lot of business owners, and I've seen this, especially with bankruptcy attorneys, there is an emotional part that we have to deal with, and we have to be honest about. So if you need assistance, or if you need someone to talk to, if you're anxious, I would encourage you to, use our mental health services. You can call 888-NYC-WELL. So that's 888-NYC-WELL. We are partnering with Thrive as well to make sure that we make that bridge. We will get through this together. New York City is a resilient city. Senator, you've known we were written off for dead in the 70s in a financial crisis. After 9/11, we were concerned about the city. Hurricane Sandy set us back, and we thought, this was going to be a problem, but we came back, and we will come back from this. We'll come back stronger. We're going to have lessons learned, and we're going to be prepared. But right now, just want you to know that we are here as a city, as a state, and the federal government. We all are here to help you get through this and come out stronger. So thank you very much, Senator, for having this conversation, and thanks, Andrew, for being my partner tonight.
Great. And I'll have some brief remarks at the end, but Andrew, any concluding thoughts before I'll just wrap it up?
No, I think it's well said. I think there are, I would really strongly encourage those participating to take advantage of the resources that exist. I think, while there's a great deal expensive and complicated and tricky about running a small business in New York, I think there is a plethora of no-cost assistance available to you. So take advantage of the resources that the city and the state have available to help you build and grow, because that's really what our focus is. That's what our mission is. We want to see you do great things and kind of bring our city back to, all the wonderful things that we appreciate. So Commissioner Bishop and Senator Kavanagh, really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it. It was a great discussion, and look forward to continuing in the future.
And so thank you. I'll just end by, first of all, thanking both of you, Commissioner Greg Bishop and Andrew Flam of the Pace University Small Business Development Center, for sharing all your thoughts and expertise and advice tonight. And also, again, thank our panelists from the earlier panel, Ellen Davidson and Josh Goldfein of the Legal Aid Society, and who spoke about housing and homelessness issues. And I also just want to take a moment to thank our translators. This is being translated simultaneously in Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. And we truly appreciate your efforts. And again, thank you to all of our constituents who provided questions and joined us tonight and have been, trying to hold us accountable and working with us over the last month and a half. Even those who have been critical, we always appreciate all of your input, and we appreciate everybody, as the Commissioner said, as New Yorkers coming together and working through this and trying to get the resources we need to contribute in the ways we know we can once we get started. And I just want to end by, echoing something the Commissioner said. This is a very trying time. I think that one of the ways that we have to get back on our feet is to recognize that, people have been ill, some people have died. I think there's been a process where mourning of that has been delayed, and we are going to go through that even as we're trying to rebuild. And so please do take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and, have a little extra sympathy for each other as New Yorkers going forward, because we've been through a lot. So with that, I will end. Once again, thank you to all of you. And if you need any assistance from our offices,
thank you.
Thank you both. Please contact us again. Our number is 212-298-5565, or Kavanagh, Kavanagh, at nysenate.gov. And again, I wish all of you good health and safety and solace at this time. And again, thank you so much for all of your words tonight.